His time will become but a small moment in life's scheme of things.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me, Susanna? You can hear me?
Light on?
Helps when you turn it on. How's that? Any better? Oh, a little better. Well, like I said, good morning. Glad to have all of you here. We have a very honored and very distinguished guest. Let me go through a little bit of Professor Lichtenstein's biography before I give you a little bit of a personal connection to all of this. Professor Wittgenstein is a history professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara, where he directs the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy. He completed his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in 1974, and before arriving at UC Santa Barbara was a member of the faculty at the University of Virginia. He's the author of several books. I don't want to take up any more time than I have to, considering we've got a great talk ahead of us. But let me just give you a couple that were my favorites. The Most Dangerous Man in Detroit, that was the biography of Walter Reuther, and The State and the Unions, the State of the Unions, I'm sorry, which also, from my own personal perspective, really shaped my own direction in my work. In any case, Professor Lichtenstein has held several fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Rockefeller, Guggenheim Foundations, the University of California, and Fulbright Commission at the Oregon Center for the Humanities. In 2008, he was elected to the Society of American Historians, and in 2012, the Sidney Hillman Foundation awarded him its Solstein, Stenton Award for Lifetime Achievement in Labor History. I'd like you to give a warm Mountain View welcome to our guest, Professor Lichtenstein.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that warm introduction. And actually, I'm glad you did that, because yes, I'm pretty old now. You let the cat out of the bag. I got my PhD in 1974. Thanks. That really, you can all figure that one out, how old I am. But I started, like a lot of people, I came out of the 60s, the New Left, and lots of us were labor historians. And studying working people more generally, in the broadest sense, the life of working people. But I found, and in sort of following this trail, that in recent years, last decade or so, that I have to study companies, capital, I have to study business. I wrote a book on Walmart about 5-6 years ago, because Walmart, I mean, it's pretty important. It's big. It employs more than 1.4 million people in the U.S., I think 2 billion around the world. And in a way, what happens at Walmart happens everywhere else, and other companies of that sort as well. So I find, and that's what this lecture is about. This talk is about how does the changing nature of business, of capital, of corporations, of the way we organize work, how does that affect really working people around the world and at home? The other thing about this lecture is, you'll see, I'm trying to end the division. We think, oh, that's abroad. Oh, those poor people in sweatshops in China, they got problems. But here at home, it's different. I'll try to make the connections between what's going on abroad and what's going on at home, connected. Not just in terms of trade flows, but I mean in terms of the structure of the way we look at work. So let's see. Okay. So here. Okay. So how many of you have remember this famous disaster? Well, it's only put a hand, 3 years old. How many of you, raise your hand if you've heard of it in any way? Okay. Well, so 3 years ago in Bangladesh, over there, between India and China, there was a factory complex called Rana Plaza, and it collapsed and killing, well, here it is, killing, more than 1,000 garment workers. And it was, the worst industrial disaster, really, certainly in many, many decades, probably the worst industrial disaster in the garment industry in world history, and maybe the worst industrial disaster ever. I mean, we have coal mines, even in the worst era of the 19th century, you get 100 people killed or other kinds of fires. But this was horrific. This is just 3 years ago in a garment factory. So, but it was not alone. I mean, it was not an isolated incident. Turns out garment factory fires take place all over Asia. And they used to take place in the United States when we had a garment industry, but they take place in Asia. So this is one also in Bangladesh. 124 died just, in November of 2012, just a few months before. So, and these kind of fires were taking place all the time. So, they of course reminded us, reminded me anyway, and those of you who had a history when we did have a big garment industry in the United States 100 years ago, in New York City, 1911, there was a garment fire in which about 150 young immigrant women, the same kind of people, of course, who were working in Bangladesh. These were Jewish and Italian immigrants, and they were trapped on the 9th floor of this tenement. Well, it wasn't really a tenement. It was actually a fairly modern building, but it was in Union Square, right in the heart of New York City. And they had no way to get up, and they leaped to their death. I mean, it was either burn up in the 9th floor or leap to their death down in Washington Square, which is where this took place. There's the building. It was kind of a famous incident because lots of people who would later become quite famous, including Franklin Roosevelt and Francis Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, and others were in New York City. They were, anyone could go watch it. You just got on the subway and you could watch this fire, and they were watching it and were kind of horrified. So, why these disasters? I mean, why did we have this disaster? Well, certainly the ones in Bangladesh. And actually, they aren't that different from why we had the disaster at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911. Well, the first reason is obviously the buildings were not so great. Bangladesh is a kind of corrupt country, corrupt government. It turns out, Bangladesh is sort of on this low-lying soil, and the Ganges River floods and things like that. So there's not much sort of good land to build buildings, and so the factory owner will get a permit to build a 4-story building, and illegally build 8 stories. And then of course when that happens, the building is shaky. And so, there were some very good inspections normally, and so the building was not legally built. But that's just, lots of things that aren't done correctly, and if you can shout about it, and if you can say, hey, something's wrong here, well then, you can avoid the disaster. And of course the workers, and there were several thousand, they knew that something was wrong. I mean, they could actually literally see cracks in the building. And the morning of the disaster, they came, and there was actually, at that point, there was a building inspector who came, and he said, no, this building is not really safe. And the workers were standing around, mulling around outside, wondering what to do, when the foreman and the people who owned the factory said, We've got, we need production, we've got to make our orders, get inside or you're fired, basically, is what they said. And so the workers reluctantly walked inside. They had no voice, they needed the jobs, they were desperate for the jobs, lots of unemployment, and the pay was low, so, okay, all right, let's go to work. So they went, and half an hour later, the goddamn building collapsed, okay? Half an hour later after they went in, on that morning in April, just 3 years ago. So, okay, but there are even more underlying reasons for this disaster in Bangladesh, and I'll, as you'll see, for the problems that we have in the structure of business and capitalism worldwide and even at home, and that was that the organization of what was being produced in this building, the Rana Plaza. Well, you know, Walmart shirts being sold at Walmart, various T-shirts for H&M, the Swedish manufacturer, all sorts of underwear for other garment for retailers and for garment manufacturers back in the United States and in Europe. I mean, it was a building. I should say it wasn't a single factory. There were many little other factories inside this Rana Plaza. So these were all the products we produced in East Asia, and the way in which world sort of trade works today is that, and I'll explain this even more in a couple more slides, is that retailers or brands in the West, in the US, in Sweden, in Germany, in Canada, they contract with companies in East Asia, China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and for goods to be produced, garments or electronics, and then there's a kind of push, a kind of squeeze. If you can't produce it cheaply, someone else will. We'll move our contract from Bangladesh to Cambodia or to Vietnam or to China. And so there was a kind of, the organization of global capitalism was such that the companies in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh and then the workers are being squeezed. Squeezed on wages, but also squeezed on safety and health. These factories are called vendors. I always look at, when I think of a vendor, I think of a hot dog vendor that you go up to and you buy a hot dog, And if you don't like the hot dog there, you go over there and buy another hot dog over there. Well, that's sort of the mentality of the Walmarts or the Nike shoes or the big companies in the West. We have vendors in East Asia. They have 2,000 or 3,000 workers, and if they can't produce the hot dogs, the T-shirts or the dresses the way we want them on time and airplane, we'll go to another one. So the factory owner, although frankly he was a disgusting character in this case, he was later arrested, he was a terrible guy, but nevertheless, he was subject to this squeeze, and he felt he had to tell those workers to go back into the building because he had a contract he had to fulfill, and he was afraid if he didn't fulfill it on time, he would not have work, the next year when the contracts were renegotiated. So there's a kind of structural issue. And furthermore, the Western firms, they don't just contract with one company in Bangladesh, but the companies in Bangladesh then subcontract and subcontract. It's a kind of chain of subcontracts. And these generate, as I'll indicate, pathologies, because the manager in Bentonville, Arkansas, who's in charge of procuring, 1 million T-shirts from East Asia, may put the first contract out with a big firm in Bangladesh, but then that firm will then subcontract, and ultimately the guy in Bentonville or in Sweden or in Seattle doesn't really know where the stuff is being produced that they've contracted for. And along the way you get many different pathologies. And so I'll talk about this. Corporate social responsibility programs. That is, there are many of these big companies in the West have these programs to ensure that conditions aren't so bad. They inspect the factories, they get reports, but they all ultimately, I think, fail because really, if they don't know who's actually producing the stuff, then they got a problem. And one example, Mattel. Who knows about? We've all been kids, so you all had toys, right? And when you were 3 or 2, you put the toy in your mouth, right? This you must all agree to, right? We were all kids. Okay, and who's had a Mattel toy? I did. Mattel is kind of okay, well-known toy company. Well, Mattel understood this. They knew that their kid that they sold toys to middle-class families in America, and they knew those families were very concerned about the safety of those toys because they knew every toddler is going to put that thing in his mouth So therefore, Mattel had tried to write scrupulous contracts with Chinese toy manufacturers that would absolutely make certain that these toys were produced under safe conditions. And in some cases, Mattel actually owned the factory in China, which is unusual. They actually owned it because they wanted to assure American middle-class parents that these toys were safe. Well, what happened was, of course, the Chinese contractor subcontracted parts of the product to other firms, and one of them was the paint. And because of this squeeze to get the cheapest toys possible, the paint was produced in a sloppy way, was poisonous. And so I think about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, turned out American kids started putting toys with poisonous paint in their mouth, and they got sick, and and Mattel practically went bankrupt. So that was an indication of how, when I talk about these pathologies in the subcontracting system, I'll talk more about that as we go along. Okay, so here's the thesis of this talk, which I'm sort of, that what we have here in these supply chains from the U.S. or Europe to Asia, Walmart owns no factories in East Asia. The Rana Plaza was owned by a Bangladesh entrepreneur. It was not owned by Walmart or not owned by H&M, which had a lot of production. It was independent. These companies are independent, but the operational control is very intimate. From the retailers and brands in the West to these companies. They are legally, yes, they're legally independent. Economically, they can be thrown on the dust heap, but the operational control is very intimate. So we have a high level of operational integration in terms of design, production, finance, and sales. What am I wearing now? What are you wearing? What? Adidas, okay, you're wearing Adidas. I've been to the factory. Those Adidas shoes, and you know where headquarters of Adidas is? Nike's in Portland. Adidas, who knows where Adidas is headquartered? Is that? Well, let's say that's.
There's one in Germany and there's one like across
Right.
from Nike.
Right. So, so the designer, the Adidas or Nike, who's wearing Nike? You're wearing Nike, okay. Nike's designed in Portland. So the shoes are designed, marketed, advertised in Portland. The manufacturing, though, takes place in China, and actually South China, in Guangdong province. And that means that the company, which had, the Yuyan, which is the manufacturing firm in South China, had 200,000 workers, huge numbers, but they did not do the designing. They were really creatures. Although they were huge and they were independent, they were creatures and depended upon Nike in Portland or Adidas in Germany or wherever it is. So you have these supply chains. They're formally independent entities, but actually they're operationally connected. So what this creates, what this means is this aggregation of the corporation, this new form of really an enhanced form of capitalism, creates a kind of legal and moral regime that absolves companies of responsibility. It fissures the workplace. And in fact, what did Walmart say about the Rana Plaza? They said, not our problem. I mean, we contracted for T-shirts, but that was an independent Bangladeshi company that did it. It was their problem. I mean, and well, yes, we may want to have kind of some corporate, kind of insist that they treat their workers right or have them clean water, but ultimately it's owned by a Bangladeshi company, and we don't have a responsibility. And that was true of all these Western firms. They could say that. Now, I'll come back to this question. I'll come back at the end of the talk to this question because there's an effort to reform it and to change it, but that was what essentially these companies are saying. So I think the solution, this is the thesis that I'll get to, is to define workers as workers, regardless of who they work for, and recreate a what I call a vertically integrated corporation. I'll explain that in a second, in law and in labor relations. Okay. So here's Walmart. Okay, and I call this, it's a retailer, it owns no factories, but really I call Walmart a manufacturer because, as I just said, they really have operational control of thousands of factories in the US and in East Asia. There are many factories in the United States that produce for Walmart, and that's true obviously for Target and for Lowe's and for any big retailer you go to. They all operate on the same principles. And now Amazon, the same thing. Amazon is identical to Walmart except for the very last part of the chain, which is how you get the product, right? Walmart, you walk in the door and buy it. Amazon, you click on your computer and get it. But everything before that is identical, okay? So that, you know, so don't think that it's the same system, really. It's just the last step is different. Okay. And here's Bentonville, the home office. So here's the supply chain. So they produce the ideas in Bentonville. They have a big headquarters in Shenzhen, which is in South China near Hong Kong, where they have 500 people there. Many of them know Chinese, many of them are Chinese. And there they go out and scour the Chinese economy, which is gigantic, to find a manufacturer, to find a maker. And then the Chinese or Bangladesh manufacturer, you know, produces it, packages it. Sometimes they subcontract these manufacturers to make parts. I indicated that. And then there's additional subcontracting. And by the time they get down to here, these people up here don't know what's going on down here. They don't know. And they say, not our problem. And then, as I indicated, prices and labor and quality are squeezed at every step because it's a highly competitive structure. And if the manufacturer in China or Bangladesh can't fulfill the tasks, well, we'll get somebody else, and they know that. Okay. So here, Nike does the same thing. This is their headquarters in Portland, wonderful place to work, 30,000 people working, but they have 1 million, 2 billion, you know, people in East Asia working as well. Okay, here, Yuyan makes, and I say I visited the Yuyan factory in Guangdong province, gigantic place, assembly line. They did have not much machinery, lots of workers, often putting glue on these machines, and I'll tell you, you know, 100-degree heat and walking through the factory, it really was oppressive, but, you know, who knows what chemicals were involved there. There was actually just 2 years ago a huge strike at this Yuyan factory because the local company was not paying money into the pension fund. Nike said, well, that's not our problem. You know, we don't employ these workers. It's employed by our contract manufacturer. Okay. So here's I think this is making. I'm not sure what they're making there. Another example. This is of course Apple. Who's got Apple? Who's got Apple right? Who's got a? Okay, good. I've got one. Okay, right here. And there it is. And here's where it's produced. Foxconn is a company which has factories all over China. The biggest one's in Shenzhen, which is just near Hong Kong, but on the Chinese side. You know, they have like 200,000 workers in one complex there. I mean, look at that. I tried really hard last year to get a tour of this company, and they said, no, we are not allowing, Western academics to tour. But, this is something out of science fiction movie, right? Okay. Now, this is important, and this sums up. Containers from China, it costs about $2,000 to take one container from South China to LA, and then there's a few hundred more dollars to get it to Texas, $100 more to get it to Texas. And each one of those ships can carry, one out 3 or 4 or 5 or 6,000 containers. The biggest ones can. And if you stuff a container, you've seen those containers with laptops. You got $10 million worth of product inside of it. It only costs $2,000. That's pretty good. Or even with shoes, maybe you got $2 million worth of Nike shoes, and it's cheap. In other words, it's cheap. It takes about 18 days. Now, what I say here is these containers are pulled, not pushed. And by that I mean this. Who's heard the phrase, make a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door? Who's heard of that? Who's heard of that? Come on. Have you heard of that? No? Well, you should. This is what they used to say. Have you heard it? Invent a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door.
Absolutely.
Heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, in other words, be clever, in business or anything else. Be clever, invent something brand new, right? And the world, and you'll be, the world will be a path to your door. They want to buy it. That is not what happens in China or East Asia or Bangladesh. It's not that a clever, smart Chinese entrepreneur decides to invent a better iPhone or a better pair of shoes, and then the American retailers beat a path to his or her door and say, oh, we want to buy them. No, as I indicated before, the designing, the planning, everything is done in the West, in Portland, or in Silicon Valley, or in Bentonville, or Issaquah, Washington, where Costco is headquartered, or Atlanta, where Home Depot is. They're the ones who design the products they want, or select from the batch, and then they order. They send an email or whatever it is to East Asia. Produce this stuff for us. Produce this stuff for us. So these are contract manufacturers. They're on contract. So that's why I say the containers are pulled, not pushed. You get it? You get the metaphor? Okay, it's not like 1900 where traveling salesmen would go running around the country and say, oh, you really ought to buy, more of this stuff, and some retailer, my father was a retailer, by the way, say, okay, I'll buy 3 dozen. No, it's not like that. It's that the retailer sends their people or an email and says, we want this. And that indicates the power relationships that are taking place in these supply chains, okay? In fact, I like the word supply chain, implying mastery and subordination, and who's on top and who's on the bottom. Chains, okay? Supply chains. I like that better than, say, the other words are like about, what are the other words? Channels, and I like the word supply chain. Okay, so, but this is true not just vis-a-vis Asia and the US, although it's very dramatic there, but also inside the US as well. So here, the rise of what I call these distended corporations, that is, where you have this system of supply chain, but legally and financially and even morally, they're distended. So the buzzwords of supply chain, subcontracting, the virtual corporation, the gig economy, you've heard of all these things, right? And so one question is, why do we have this, and we don't have what I call vertical integration, which we used to, from manufacturer to sales. We used to have that. Why? So here, 100 years ago, the Ford River Rouge plant outside Detroit, gigantic place. Henry, you can see many different units there, and Henry Ford used to brag that he would order the iron ore from northern Minnesota and the wood when cars were still partly made of wood from Michigan, and the rubber from Brazil. He owned the rubber plantation in Brazil. He owned the iron mines in Minnesota. He owned forests in Michigan. He'd bring it all together, and then 33 hours later, a Model T would chug off the line. It was all totally integration. It was all there. Every part of the car was controlled, was owned. Every manufacturing and assembly aspect of the Ford car 100 years ago was owned by Ford. And Andrew Carnegie, when he created U.S. Steel, he bragged in the same way. We don't buy anything on the market. We make it. We make it. General Motors very quickly emulated Henry Ford and brought Ford's system to a kind of scientific, and I should stop it at less than noon, right? Okay, so here, I love this. Alfred Sloan was the famous president of General Motors in the early 20s. This is 1921. This is the General Motors organization chart. Every unit here is like, a part, of the, some manufacturing, something, Chevrolet or whatever it is. It's all, these lines are real lines. They are legal, financial. They own the thing. This is the General Motors organization chart. Kind of, maybe today, you might think, oh my God, I wouldn't want to be trapped in that matrix. But that was the idea. That was the idea of the corporation 100 years ago. Yes, we want everything controlled. United Fruit Company, same thing. Getting bananas from Central America. Early 1890s, they invent, they had ice ships and they had warehouses in Boston. But when they were buying the bananas, sometimes the bananas were rotten, sometimes they didn't get there on time. So they said, we have to have it all. We're going to buy those plantations, we're going to own the ships, own the ports, own the warehouses. It's going to be one system. That lasted until the 1960s when, for political reasons and others, United Fruit began to sell off its plantations. Okay, so a young economist named Ronald Coase tried to explain what's going on here. He came to the US in the 20s and early, and he wrote a famous paper called The Nature of the Firm. Why are Ford and GM so big? Why are they vertically integrated? Why don't they buy stuff like Walmart does today and Nike does? Why don't they just buy stuff from other people and then assemble it? Why do they own this stuff? He said, well, the reason is that the transaction costs would be too great to buy it on the open market. And maybe back in the 20s, when we didn't have email, all we had were phones, and transport wasn't so great. That'd be too expensive to have communications to ensure quality, to bargain with it would be expensive to bargain with the producer. So therefore, let's buy it, put it under our roof, and we'll own it. And really, what he's saying is that these giant corporations like General Motors and Ford and U.S. Steel are planning bureaucracies. The companies are islands of conscious power in the larger market. And his metaphor was buttermilk. I guess I haven't made buttermilk, but I guess you have, maybe you're making butter. You have kind of a liquid there, and then things begin to coagulate. Well, corporations are these coagulated little islands of conscious power. That is what management's doing in a sea, and the sea is the market. The rest of the buttermilk is the market, and over time the coagulated little bits get bigger and bigger, and the market gets less and less. That's what he said was what the American economy was like in the middle of the 20th century. So the question is, why do we today have more buttermilk and less coagulated lumps? And that's what we seem to be having. So we go on here. So another famous writer and management consultant, Peter Drucker, made the same argument a few years later. Wrote a book on General Motors, which said General Motors is like the Soviet commissariat of heavy industry. It's a planning bureaucracy. The market really doesn't enter in, and that was true. He wrote that in 1950. So, organized labor loves vertically integrated firms. You sign a deal, and you cover everybody. So here's, recent bargaining at Ford. The U.S. government, and really had many of its laws from the 1930s and 40s and 50s based on the idea of vertically integrated corporations. Now, this is a picture of Sewell Avery, a very conservative guy who's head of Montgomery Ward, which is a retailer. It doesn't exist anymore, went bankrupt. And he's being carried out of his office by two troops in the middle of World War II because he failed to adhere to a government order demanding that he recognize a trade union. And so he was the symbol, he definitely controlled the whole company. And so they're, kind of arrested, they didn't really arrest him, but they're symbolically moving him out of the office. So, and presumably he had the power to order everyone down the supply chain to adhere to this government edict, which he had failed to do. Okay, so what this really got at was who's a worker and who's the boss. And the New Dealers back in the 30s, when many labor laws were being created, they said, well, we have to have a very expansive definition of employee. It means anyone who is suffered or permitted to work, regardless of who the legal boss is, regardless of the attenuated or supply chain that someone may find themselves employed in. And our model for how production takes place should be this vertically integrated corporation like GM and Ford. And so the Fair Labor Standards Act, the National Labor Relations Board, the Internal Revenue Service, they favor a broad and inclusive interpretation of employee, anyone economically dependent on the business employer, regardless of skill level. So that would mean that maybe some of those people in Bangladesh really are employees, not of a local Bangladeshi company, but of Walmart or H&M or the retailer who really has the power. Economic realities, not legal agreement, determine the status. That's what the New Dealers wanted, but that's not what we ended up with. I should say here that part of my talk, the title for it, was taken from a new book by this fellow, David Wield, who is now in the Obama administration, appointed to the Labor Department, trying to figure out how to create a labor law that will work for workers in this world of fissured employment. Okay, I have to. I'm going to. So, as I say, what happens with fissured employment, both in Bangladesh and the U.S., it really sidesteps labor and state regulation. It shifts risk down the supply chain so that the unemployment and bad product is at the hands of the local supplier, the local firm, and then ultimately the worker. And really, you have a new concept of the corporation from a social organization, like General Motors or Ford 100 years ago, to a legal entity designed simply to boost shareholder value. I can't get into this too much, but the last 30 years has been kind of a revolution in how we think of what a corporation is. And really, what I'm saying is that technological and judicial innovations make for less butter and more butter milk. It becomes easier for companies to sidestep their legal and financial obligations to those who work for them or to the firms that supply them. And so now this in one sense has been going on for years. Franchising is a great example of this. Singer Sewing Machine Company invented franchising back in the 19th century when every dealer, Singer Sewing Machines were sold worldwide. Russia, China, Latin America. And the person who sold them was responsible for repairing them. Well, Singer couldn't control and had no way of knowing what these far-flung individuals were doing. So they said, we'll just give you a license to sell these machines. You really have an independent business. You buy them from us and then you repair them and sell them. So Singer Sewing Machines were first franchised. Automobiles were franchised too. When you go to buy a car, you aren't buying it from Chrysler or GM or Toyota, you're buying it from the dealer. So that's a franchise as well. That's 100 years old. But more recently, 80% of all hotel properties are franchised. In other words, the label is there, Days Inn or Ramada or whatever it is, but the owner is actually an independent entrepreneur. And of course, fast food. One of the issues today, you've been hearing about the $15 an hour fast food initiatives. Well, one of the problems is, who's going to pay that 15 bucks? McDonald's with its headquarters in Chicago, or the 90% of all McDonald's franchisees that are owned by local independent people. And here, don't read this. This is the contract. This is the contract for Taco Bell. Which again, it symbolizes the spurious nature of the independence that these franchisees have. Every single thing that a Taco Bell independent owner does with his or her franchise is controlled and put in this contract. I mean, it's everything except the wages. Except the wages. Okay. So they're really, and so as a result, 10% of all franchisees go bankrupt every year. Okay. Okay. And the same is true, as you know, FedEx. You get a delivery. This is FedEx. This is independent contractor. McDonald's, janitorial service. These are all independent contractors. The fissuring of the workforce is more and more. Same is true in Amazon fulfillment centers, of which there are now 50, and there are going to be 100 all over the country. The people who work there don't work for Amazon. They work for independent contractors who are hired by Amazon, and sometimes they work for independent contractors who are hired by independent contractors who then work for Amazon. So here you have an amazingly technologically sophisticated company which really is using a 19th century form of labor recruitment. Okay, Uber. I don't know if okay, Uber is the ultimate case. Okay, I'm almost finished. And a history lesson, now a little history lesson from a garment union in New York City, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which had exactly the same problems that we have today with Bangladesh. That fire, Triangle Shirtwaist fire, the ILGW came out of that fire. Okay, the same problem, although in 100 years ago in New York City, all the production took place in the city, it was also these supply chains, Macy's or Gimbel's or some other manufacturer, they didn't own the shops that were producing this the suits or the shirtwaists for them. They subcontracted those to other firms, and this created a problem. And the ILGW wanted to make capital the ultimate buyer, the big department stores, the big, legally and financially responsible. And so they tried to do this with what they call triangular bargaining, the retailer, the contractor, and the union. And here, so they wanted to get rid of this, get rid of these outside contracting, which is equivalent today to the kind of shops that burn down in Bangladesh and China. Get rid of that, and create a vertically integrated industry. This is one of the leaders of the garment trades. Centralized, like General Motors. They want to copy General Motors in the garment trades. They could do it. And so they created something called jobbers agreements. The jobber is just an archaic name for the retailer or the guy who finally is responsible for paying for the product. Okay, Walmart is a jobber. Nike is a jobber. That was the phrase they used. So what they will do is the point would be to have triangular bargaining between the union, the manufacturer who actually made the stuff, and the jobber. And under the New Deal in the early 1930s, the retail trade, they succeeded in doing that. Here's the union, the contractor, and this is the ultimate buyer. They had the money. They demanded the money. This guy was getting squeezed, but the money would go through him to there. And for 2 generations, garment workers made 75% of what auto workers made. It worked for a while. So really, today, in Bangladesh, we now have a jobbers agreement signed by 180 European firms, namely the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety. It's a jobbers agreement signed by unions, governments, and brands, not just a corporate social responsibility public relations effort. The brands, that is the jobbers, pay for the upgrades and agree to keep production in place for 2 years. It's legally enforceable, and many, many firms have signed it, mainly Europeans, but although in the US they don't. H&M, the Swedish, who knows about H&M? Any? Pretty good dresses, right? Okay, they signed it, they agreed to it. They had a lot of production in Bangladesh. They kind of bargained about it, they had disputes, but it's kind of bargaining going on. Here's a kind of non-governmental organization report. But Walmart, this is America, I'm almost finished here. Walmart says, we're not going to sign it. It introduces requirements, including governance and dispute resolution mechanisms on supply chain matters that are appropriately left to retailers, suppliers, and government. In other words, we won't sign it, because they know it does legally make them responsible. The National Retail Federation, US, which Walmart really controls, says the liability issue, that's a legal term, that means money. Well, liability is a great concern, at least on this side of the Atlantic. Those Europeans may do it, but we aren't going to do it. For US corporations, there's a fear that someone will try to impose liability and responsibility if something goes awry in the global supply chain. We may have to pay, yes, if something goes wrong in our supply chain. And to that I say, yes. Thank you. Okay, you're right there, and then you're next.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
First of all, do you think the unions will go away in due time because of all the workplace and how we're shifting it all around? And then the next question is, do you have an opinion on the $15 an hour minimum wage?
Yeah, well, the unions have been hurt. The point is, unions have been hurt by that. If you can't figure out who to bargain with, then what to do? That's part of the problem. And part of the problem both in Asia and America. If you're a franchise, if you're days in and they're all franchised, then technically your boss is maybe this sort of, not to be, well, is an undercapitalized local figure who can't afford it. But when the real money and power is in some larger firm, that's part of the problem and one of the reasons for weaknesses of unions. They aren't all in this situation, but this is one of the main problems. $15, yes, I'm in favor of it. Very much, I'm in favor of it. For the following reason. The main objection is, well, it's 15 bucks. Maybe in Texas, rural Texas, that's a lot of money. And that would mean that, say, some local fast food company would have problems. Well, historically, higher wages have produced technological change, which has eliminated workers. We don't have a lot of as many farmhands as we used to. That was miserable work. That's a good thing we don't have farmhands anymore. It's a good thing that agriculture is technologically efficient. So I think it would be a great thing if every time you go to a fast food store, you had to do it all yourself with all sorts of buttons and such. It would be those jobs should be eliminated, and the $15 that people will get will then be spent in other parts of the economy, and that will raise the general employment and wage for it. Yeah, you had a question.
Well, yes, sir. The thing is, I'm a father,
Yeah.
Husband,
Yeah.
homeowner, so my life is my business, right? I don't purchase an item if I don't know where it came from.
Yeah.
You know, if it was obtained illegally, I won't purchase it.
Yeah.
I have a moral obligation.
Yeah.
When it comes down to hiring fellow workers to do home repairs that are outside of my personal scope, I won't hire someone who is, let's say, just simply illegal.
Yeah.
Okay, because there is a social obligation. I don't understand why this is taking so long. Why are the companies, why is this not happening sooner? For example, whenever you contract out work, and why did they not 100 years ago include the stipulation that you are not allowed to subcontract?
They fought it, and there is no law preventing subcontracting of that sort. And the other thing, of course, you don't know. You could take a T-shirt off and look at the label. It probably says someplace in Asia, but you don't know actually precisely where it was produced. You know, because that's subcontracting problem. And so the answer is people have fought it, and then also they don't have the knowledge about it. So it's that's a problem. That's a problem. And so one way to resolve it, I think, accords of this sort. Which could be also multiplied, the Bangladesh Accord, which was negotiated after these disasters, could be, and Uber, and say Uber, the problem Uber, they're now trying to do that. The local governments in Seattle and some places are trying to regulate Uber in such a way that the independent contractors, at least technically, who work for it, will be at least given certain, protections. But they're fighting it. Hey, they're fighting it. You seem frustrated, but these companies, they hire very good lawyers to fight it.
I understand that business is money, and money is business, but again, it just seems like there should be a connected moral and social obligation.
Well, no, I agree with that. One question over here, then we'll go back. Then we'll go to you. You were go ahead.
Yes. Do you see any foreseeable future for Walmart will succeed?
Well, I think they are being put under some pressure in various ways. Walmart has made accommodations in some ways. They raised actually their own wages a little bit last year, this year. They did have a very extensive corporate social responsibility organization, but they didn't want to sign this Bangladesh Accord. It requires lots of prodding by both organized groups and the government. And let me say this, in other countries which have stronger regulatory regimes and stronger labor movements and maybe more aware consumers, Walmart operates differently. So the answer is it's possible, okay? It's not impossible. You had a question right there.
So we have these two different systems, the vertically integrated versus the distended. And we started out vertically integrated because there were these natural business obstacles. It was expensive to buy things on the open market.
Yeah.
However, the historical trend of almost every single commodity is that it gets cheaper.
That's true.
Because of technological advances, it gets cheaper. So which makes the distended model more acceptable just from a bottom line standpoint.
Good.
So if we've got these historical trends and the just general commodity market working against us and pushing us toward this more distended, is there any non-regulatory way that we can begin to reverse those trends and push it back towards vertical integration?
That's a very good question. in other words, does it require the state? Is the state necessary? That's a really good question. The answer is probably it does require the state today. But let me just make that a little bit, the theory of the New Deal, which is now 70 years old, was not that the U.S. government is going to send an inspector to every factory, that Ford has or that GM has or whatever it is, and look, under the covers and see, are the wages good or is the safety good? They couldn't do that. There aren't enough bureaucrats, pointy-headed or not pointy-headed, to do that, right? Can't do it. It's true today as well. Therefore, the U.S. government was going to create laws which would empower workers, and sometimes consumers, by the way, but workers, to form organizations which would be permanently, in place in the factories or the stores or whatever they were, and then you would have the system of they call it voluntary, they call it private, but then you'd have these workers and the unions and the companies would then bargain over all sorts of questions, not just wages, but safety, health, and including, when the labor was really strong in the 40s, the products they'd make. The UAW wanted the auto companies to produce a small car so that they could fight European competition. Now that system's totally broken down. And clearly in retail trade, for example, it doesn't exist at all, and it's totally broken down. But so that is government kind of indirect, you see what I'm saying? And I think that was a smart idea, but it's now, for a variety of reasons, partly because a lot of smart lawyers employed by corporations have broken that system. There was another question somewhere else. Yes, ma'am. Great questions.
So back when, so the story I've heard with Walmart is that on their anti-union stance, that back when Sam Walton was alive, it was more because you should treat your workers well enough that they don't need to unionize. And once he died, that's when the organization, the corporation, shifted its values. Have you found that to be true?
Well, I read a book on Walmart. I don't need to flog my book. I think you can buy it for $7 now from Amazon. So I have a whole section on that. The answer is that Walmart was founded in northwest Arkansas. Which was an area of the country which the civil rights movement had skipped. There were no blacks there. The New Deal, it was agriculture, so the New Deal, the labor movement had skipped. And later on, the feminist movement had skipped. It was just a kind of isolated place, a certain part of the Ozarks. So a kind of paternalism that Sam Walton could project did exist. And he was very, very popular among his employees in the very early days. Partly this was because there were thousands, tens of thousands of women, mainly women, who were sort of, given the agricultural revolution of those days, were, pushed off the farms. They wanted, hey, I want something to do. If I can't get a job working for the local government or the hospital, hey, there's a retail store I'll work for. So yes, in the very early days, there was a kind of paternalism there, which was reciprocated. But of course, Sam Walton was ambitious, and he didn't want to stay just in northwest Arkansas, so he began to put, stores all over the country, and so the system broke down rather quickly. And I have just one little, I don't have time. Afterwards, I'll tell you this little story. Sorry, there were wonderful questions here. You had a question.
If the minimum wage was increased to $15 an hour, but it eliminated those jobs, would that be a little bit counterproductive, or would new jobs be created?
That's a good question, and the argument against it is precisely that.
I'm in favor of it.
But the argument against it is that it will eliminate jobs. So the question becomes how many jobs? And we do know, and here, we know that at a certain point, sure, there will be kind of there will be a job effect, a elimination of jobs. But the countering that is more money in circulation among poor people, who we know for sure will immediately spend every penny, which is they need to. They won't sock it away. They will immediately spend it, and that's the Keynesian effect, where you put money in circulation and it gets going. So most economists think certainly raising the minimum wage to $12 would have practically no employment effects. $15, of course, that's not till the year 2020. So it's a kind of a little bit of experiment. It is. But I think that, as I said, when you consider the elimination of farmhands, the elimination of blacksmiths, the elimination of clerks in stores who had to grab the product from the shelf behind you and bring it to you. I mean, these are all labor, we have labor. We're in favor of labor-saving things in America, technologically and also organizationally and financially. These are great questions. Yes?
So do you think the fear of the cost of living kind of rising along with the minimum wage, do you think that fear is unfounded then?
Well, right now, cost of living, we're practically at zero. I mean, right now it's nothing. I mean, if anything, this is a good time to do it because we don't have inflation. Now, one of the arguments is this, that, okay, let's say you raise the wages of Walmart workers to $15 an hour, then the cost of products will go up. Yeah, it will. It will. A penny or 2 pennies. But the money, a normal household, if they really wanted to, could buy about 30% of everything they spent at Walmart. You really could. Groceries and clothing, about 30%. But you can't buy a college education, you can't buy medical care, you can't buy a car yet, you can't buy vacations at Walmart. So that higher wage that you got, you can pay for that stuff, and then you pay a little bit more for your t-shirts, a penny or 2 more. So I think in the end it would work out. Other questions? You have great questions.
I think there was a federal law to hold corporate completely accountable for the supply chain.
Well, right, that's happened. Yes, well, that's right now it's being debated right now. That is, who is the employer? The definition of who's the employer. So, and there's litigation taking place right now in laws. For example, FedEx. Okay, FedEx. Who gets FedEx? I get FedEx. Those nice trucks come along, are they all shiny? Those trucks are not owned by FedEx. They're owned by the owner-operator. Now, the contract, like the Taco Bell contract, the owner-operator, he can't go around in a jalopy delivering FedEx packages. He has to have this truck exactly with those colors and exactly on that schedule, and et cetera. So the National Labor Relations Board says, hey, FedEx is the employer of this guy. He's not an independent contractor. FedEx says, oh no, he's an independent contractor. So they're fighting that right now. So law, it's not just technological change. Law could shift in such a way that McDonald's is responsible for its franchisees, FedEx is responsible for the trucks, and Walmart or Nike or H&M is responsible more for the factories that produce this stuff. You can change that in terms of the law.
Is that, you think that's very likely to happen?
I think we're moving in that direction, actually. We are moving. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're moving in that direction. And all those high-priced lawyers are fighting it. Another question. Anyone? Do I have, what was it? Last week, what are we doing on time?
It's all right.
Okay.
I'm happy to go forever. You had a question, yeah.
Yes, if we ever got to a point where hypothetically all manual labor could be automated, would you be in favor of guaranteed basic income?
These are great questions. I probably would, yes. I probably would. In this sense, that we already have forms of income that go to people not based on their work. So, for example, like drinking water. We expect, whether you pay tax or not, to get clean drinking water. We expect, whether you pay tax or not, to get clean air. Healthcare is sort of moving in that direction. You don't have to have an income. So there are ways to sustain the social wage without an income. Would this make everyone sort of what do you call it, sort of a lazy bum? Because we need the incentive. Well, I think there are other incentives to work aside from just having a hamburger every so often. I think there's vanity and ambition and luxury. So, but this is a purely theoretical question. I think it comes down, meets the rubber when you're talking about, say in Texas, the fight over expanding the Medicaid, which the Texas government could do if it would choose, which would have the effect of essentially increasing the income, the real income of probably more than 1 million Texans. And that's a fight that's being fought out right now in almost every state in the country. So, one more question back there. Yeah.
Okay, so if we go back to your original example.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does how does Walmart relate to the fact that the building itself wasn't built correctly, and then
Yeah.
from our standards wasn't built to code? And so
Yeah.
how do we impose
Yeah.
building standards and building codes in an
Right.
international environment? And so isn't really the government
Right.
of Bangladesh responsible
Right.
for its lack of oversight in building codes? Negligence doesn't fall on the Walmart for that, it falls onto the government of Bangladesh. I mean, from a legal standpoint,
Yeah.
you know, your example doesn't really put the blame on Walmart
Well-
just because it buys the stuff. Should be putting the blame on the contractor who misbuilt and misrepresented what he was building, and no oversight in terms of regulation from a government that didn't really give a damn about how big the building was to begin
Right.
with.
Thanks for asking that question, because I jumped over that too fast because I was running out of time.
Yeah.
And here's the answer. This thing called the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety was signed by the International Labor Organization, by the 180, now 200 different brands, i.e. the H&Ms and Nike, and I think Nike and the brands around the world. Also signed by the Bangladesh Manufacturers Association, and also signed by the trade unions, although they're kind of very weak. This accord says that under the leadership of the International Labor Organization, which is an organization in Geneva, but worldwide, its inspectors and will be hired directly by the ILO, therefore they won't be corrupt, and who will go look at every one of these factories. If a factory is found to be not up to code, they will go to the owner, who's a member of the Bangladesh Manufacturers Association, and say, you need to spend $500,000 or whatever it is to bring this factory up to code. Okay?
Whose code standard are we talking about?
We're talking about a
Bangladesh code standard?
well, yes,
or
yes, it is a Bangladesh code standard, which on paper is actually quite good. The problem was always ineffective at policing. Okay, it was, and that code standard was written probably by British bureaucrats, years ago. Okay, but here's the important point: if the local manufacturer does not have the money to make that factory safe, then it's the legal obligation of the brand, the retailer, who is sourcing from that factory to pay up, to ensure that it's done. That's a legal obligation, and they can be sued in Western courts, like the U.S. or Sweden or Germany or England.
before there's any actual negligence?
Yeah, they can be, well, if they fail, yes, before there's another disaster, if they fail to provide the funds to do remediation on that factory. So it does have some teeth in it, and it does sort of integrate that supply chain a little bit. See, it's not perfect and et cetera, but I'm glad you asked the question, because I got to the mechanisms of the details of it, how it actually works. Okay?
Okay.
Yes?
But I do think that consumer education is so important, what's going on here today and other places, because the marketplace responds to how we behave as consumers most effectively. And the more we know about, how these relationships work around the world, and we can make choices in how we shop, and the tea industry and in India, and how people are treated.
I would only modify your answer to say organized consumers.
Organized
consumers. So non-governmental organizations of various sorts, everything from environmental ones dealing with whales, Greenpeace, to Amnesty International dealing with political prisoners, to Workers' Rights Consortium dealing with workers who produce clothing. They're organized. They're consumers. Yeah, they're consumers, but they're organized, and they can put the pressure. And they've actually have kept the pressure on, and I think, but they have to be organized. It can't be you just walk into the store and say, I'll buy this versus that. Then I don't think that has the impact. Okay.
My law doesn't let me do it.
But just, can you comment a little bit more? Just one last question, for me at least. The political arena, how the corporations, we got elections going on, and it's back to consumers. We're political consumers also, and I think it's important in that context where the rules, the regulations, who's making them, but who's enforcing them, and the pressures that have come in the last 30 years to lead to this.
Well, here's where I would differ from actually both Bernie and Donald, okay? I'm disagreeing with both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, okay? It is true that and certainly I think it's more true in the 1980s and 90s than today, that maybe the early 20th century, early 21st century, that the various kinds of international trade deals which have sent manufacturing to Mexico or East Asia, have hurt manufacturing workers. I mean, the garment industry doesn't hardly exist in the United States. Electronics, you cannot find an American-made, fully made, radio or cell phone or TV. You can't. They're all from Korea, Taiwan, China. So I agree with that. However, as a cause of the income stagnation that all Americans experience, or all working Americans, really the bottom, say 2/3 of the population have experienced in the last 25 years, I think trade is less important than, say, the policies of, say, the great retailers of this country who employ more workers than all the manufacturers together, the retailers, or the service industries. So I think that's where, the crunch is really coming. And furthermore, my solution to this is not to forbid trade with East Asia or put high tariffs, but to raise the standards, the general wage and safety and standards in Asia, so that then they become a consuming public, and are purchasing not just their own T-shirts, but machine tools. Now, Germany, for example, has a very vital export industry in things like optics and machine tools and kind of precision instruments, and they sell tons of stuff to China. And Germany has a very low unemployment rate today, which is why, in part, the immigration question is so difficult, because they actually want immigrants. So I think that I'm on the trade on the way that Bernie and Trump both put the trade thing is not quite the way I would do it. Ronnie? Okay.
How would you do it?
Well, okay. Well, no. How I would do it is I would have international trade, but I would insist on very vigorous protections for labor abroad and at home, and environmental protections as well. Absolutely, and then it would become rational for these big retailers to insource more of the stuff in the United States, because they wouldn't be, well, frankly, look, Bangladesh is an authoritarian country. China is definitely authoritarian. These are not democratic countries. The workers there are not fully free. Well, so we're competing with workers who are not free. Well, naturally, that's unfair. So and I would say the same thing is true in the United States. I mean, I think that, insofar as certainly true years ago, and I think it's true today, there are regional disparities in the kind of rights that workers have vis-a-vis states. I'm for leveling that out, and so that we have a level playing field in the U.S. Yes, ma'am.
This is to the $15
Dollar,
wage. If, let's say it goes through,
Yep.
and now we're receiving $15. The people that got laid off, fired, let's say they all decided to go back to school. So when they decide to go back to school, the minimum hours for you to be able to get benefits through Texas is 20 hours. 20 hours, either working or finding another job, or working or going to school. That's the minimum for you to actually be able to receive benefits.
Benefits for going when you're
To get TANF, to get food stamps, all that. So by these people going back to school, it would be a great number, because they would all have been laid off, or it wouldn't just be a small number, it would be a big number, because they would all be replaced by technology. So by them going back to school, they would be asking more government assistance. Now that number would be big. The amount they would be receiving, depending on how they live, how many kids they have, or their situation. So the number that they would be asking for the government would be a broad number,
Okay, well, go ahead, yeah.
So, eventually, the people that are paying the taxes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's people right now that get upset that this money is going to them.
Mhm.
So eventually, those same people would get even more upset because of the situation. So my question is, what's your opinion when it comes to if that was to happen?
A couple of things. One is, well, we don't know actually the number that we laid off, and then we're making the assumption that at $15 an hour, which will not take place till 2020 or 21, there could be a wage effect. But of course that's partly mitigated by the fact that people have money to spend, and so their other employment as relatively expended. The other thing on taxes is this: taxes are too low, especially in the state of Texas. Not too low for you and for people in this room, but for the rich. Southern states, Texas is a regressive, reactionary tax regime. The rich can pay a lot more. So it's not true that if you doubled the size of the college capacity and provided support for everyone who wanted to go to school, that the taxes on ordinary people would go up. Unless, I mean, if it would be quite entirely feasible if you have the right political movement to raise taxes on the rich. And the tax rates on the rich in the United States have to, from the 1950s on, have declined. They've declined. Under Obama, they went up a little bit to pay for Obamacare, on the state level, Texas taxes are too low on the rich. And so I don't think, and of course it becomes a stratagem of conservative politicians to say if taxes go up, the poor will pay them. But I think if you have the right political movement, you make the oil barons and the real estate barons pay. And that's one of the problems of taxes throughout the country, and partly in the West and the South. More so. But so I think the answer is it's not necessary that you get a backlash against more people, and expensive colleges going up.
We want to thank you so
You're
much
welcome.
on behalf of Mountain View.